Hello and welcome to another episode of TPA TV. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ekström, who is the Chief Executive of the Swedish Taxpayers Association. And Christian, this is a really interesting time to be speaking to you this morning. Firstly, thank you so much for taking the time because 2 months today, actually, we have the next UK budget. And it's essentially well established now within Westminster, within the country, that really the only solution to Britain's very severe economic and fiscal woes is a major program of spending cuts. But regrettably, we have a government that, even though I think it itself recognises that, it doesn't know how on earth to do it. So every time it's attempted to reduce spending, in particular in its attempts to reduce welfare spending, it's completely failed. Even though it has a huge parliamentary majority, it hasn't been able to get anything through. And so as a result, all of the talk about the upcoming budget and dealing with the massive deficit and the massive hole in the public finances are focused on tax rises, and they're looking at tax rises across the board, and that's despite the fact that last year's tax rises were so damaging. But Sweden does provide an alternative case, and it does show a way that spending can be reduced, because in the 1990s you had a situation which was roughly similar to the one we have now, and actually you came through at the other end with a healthier economy. So could you tell us a little bit about exactly the situation of Sweden in the 1980s going into the 1990s, and then we can talk about how you solved the situation.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me. Let me give you a brief background. Sweden was one of the poorest countries in Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we had starvation in Sweden, and 20% of the population left to migrate to the US. But in the late 19th century, things started to change. We had a lot of market reforms and liberalizations. We built mostly privately railroads and deregulated a lot of professions. And this led to a booming economy. Business started and grew, and especially innovation-based industry companies like a ball bearing company that is still huge in Sweden. So we had a lot of engineers starting their own companies. We did have a growing welfare state, just like almost every other European country, but it grew no faster than the economy for the first half of the 20th century. And living standards was booming along with the economy. But we got a lot of regulations, especially during World War II. The financial market was strongly regulated, and the housing market, which is still regulated. We have rent control in Sweden, which is harming us in many ways. And then taxation started to rise more than in other countries. But we still surfed during the 50s and 60s. We still surfed on the liberalizations that we made earlier on. And everybody still had better salaries, and the government could afford more social welfare. But and in 1970, we were one of the richest countries in the world, alongside with Switzerland. But then things started to go south. Taxes rose and was hidden from the people of Sweden, and we started to regulate even more. And actually, there were plans in Sweden of having unionly owned companies. The companies in Sweden were to be taken over by the unions, which would have made Sweden like Albania or something. Mm-hmm. The economy was strictly regulated, and the focus was not on growth, or stable inflation, but full employment. And we had several devaluations of the Swedish currency, the krona, during the 70s and 80s. We had devaluations almost every year. And the marginal taxes were around 80% if you had a full-time job. And the only way to avoid them was by taking loans on your house. So we had a really problematic situation. And even the Social Democrats that ruled in Sweden for most of this period understood that this couldn't really work. So during the mid-80s, they started to deregulate the finance markets and the currency. But there were still many regulations in the economy. And So these deregulations had some unforeseen effects, at least for the politicians that had no memory of how Sweden worked without the regulations before the World War. And since we still had high taxes and tax deductions for loan, people and businesses had no real because if you own property, you had no real interest rate since the inflation was so big.
Yeah.
So we had a booming market for buying property, and this led to a real estate bubble that eventually bursted with skyrocketing unemployment and a rising national debt as a consequence.
And what year was this at this point?
This is 1991.
Yeah.
But I mean, the problems build up,
Sure.
And then we had a crash in 91, 92. And due to this crash, the financial markets started speculating against the Swedish currency, the krona. At the same time, we had as a goal to have a fixed currency, and this led to a politically controlled national bank. So for a period of time in the early 90s, we had interest rates of 500%.
Wow.
And this and the crisis in the real estate sector led to a huge bank crisis. But the good thing was that we had during the 1991 to 1994, we had a center-right government, and they did some things that was, I mean, it was a tough situation, but they did take some initiatives that was really good.
Yeah.
For one example, we didn't bail out the banks because that would have led to moral hazard. But the government took over the banks to later on sell them back to the market.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't bail them out. They were not too big to fail, but the government took them over. And even though I don't like governmentally owned banks, that was actually better than
Preferable, sure,
just
yeah.
giving them the money.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many echoes, I think, to now, but also, of course, any historian of 1970s England will hear so many echoes in the Swedish experience to what we saw prior to Margaret Thatcher. You had a period where the unions were dominant, where you had a government that was responsible for setting wages and prices in huge amounts of the economy, not just the nationalised sector, but even the private sector. The government set a lot of the policy around how much wages could go up, how much prices could go up. You had frequent devaluations of the currency because we had such a significant trade imbalance. Whole range of other things that really caught my eye there as well. Again, you mentioned the top rate of tax. We had 83% in the 1970s, 98% for unearned income. So if it's shares and dividends and all of that, and the way that people got round some of those high tax rates were that mortgage payments were deductible from your taxable income.
Yeah.
Which meant that, and it's one of the reasons why Britain has become home ownership has become so important to England as a society, and one of the reasons is the tax policy that led to that, because the only way that you could essentially become affluent in any shape or sense of form is if vast amounts of your income went on paying your mortgage, because otherwise it simply went to the state. Whereas at least if it's going on your mortgage, it's going towards one of your assets that you can then benefit from. Of course, the situation is different now. We do have a floating currency. The top rate of tax is still too high here. It's 45p, but it's not where it used to be. The problem we have now is not so much on the tax side, and not even so much on government control side in the UK. It's just the size of our welfare state. We spend hundreds of billions of pounds on supporting pensioners who probably now retire too early, given how high the life expectancy is, and that simply are given a pension that is no longer affordable. But also we have 10 million working age people out of work, many of which receive benefits. So what were the big areas of spending that the government looked at in Sweden in the 1990s that they were able to cut back on? And was welfare one of them? And was welfare one of the big problems at the time?
Yeah, we had a huge public sector, and that was cut down actually by the Social Democrats by portions, I would say.
Mm.
And actually, I think that it was good. It was a good thing that the Social Democrats did this because they had to. I mean, never
Yeah.
waste a good crisis. Uh, but at the same time, and the following years, we had a lot of reforms that really helped us to where we are now. We got an independent central bank, which is, I mean, great. The fact that we didn't have it was a huge problem. And they have an inflation target as their guiding principle. And we have a fiscal policy framework with a surplus target. In fact, it's a balanced target, but surplus is the target, or is supposed to be the target. And we have reduced our national debt, and that has been the focus for both center-right governments and social democratic uh, uh, governments. And one of the plans of the government from between 1991 and 1994 was to freeze spending, public spending in every sector. I would say we still have a huge public sector, but we actually it didn't grow as fast as it used to do, because then we would have been like East Germany or something.
Yeah.
So we held back spending, and we did a lot of deregulations after that.
Yeah.
And since a consequence of that is we have, for the first time in like 80 years, we have new big companies like Klarna or Spotify
Yeah.
emerging from Sweden. We didn't have that for like 60 years. We had no new companies growing in Sweden for many, many years. It was only the public sector that grew. But due to tax cuts, I mean, we went from a tax burden of 50%, and today it's less than 41. And I mean, it's still high, but it's the lowest since 1975. So, I mean, for sure, you have to cut down the public sector and look at what you can do. But the most important thing is to hold it back and not allowing it to grow. Because if you have a
Yes.
growing economy, the economy grows faster than the public sector. So that's I mean, an elegant way to decrease the tax burden.
Yeah.
But I mean, we did a lot of good things back especially during the 90s and early 2000s. And after that, we've had quite significant tax cuts. But we still have a lot of things to deal with, especially on the municipal side, which is
Yeah.
half of the Swedish public sector, and it's of course extremely inefficient. And I mean, you have the NHS, which I guess is not a very efficient way
No.
of dealing with healthcare, but
No.
we have like the same kind of problem with poor money. And that is actually the case in a crisis. You have the opportunity to take care of things that you know doesn't work.
And that
But
would normally be politically difficult to do
yeah,
in times where things are generally ticking along well. It can be very difficult to make major reforms because people ask the question, well, if it's not broken, why fix it? And actually, often it
yeah.
is broken. We just don't recognize how broken it is.
No, but and the solution always is, from a political perspective. I mean, the easiest thing to show that you are willing to take action is to pour money on the problem.
Yeah.
But and we do that. I mean, we still do that. We have I mean, in Sweden, the police we've doubled their funds the last 10 years, and they're so inefficient that they solve less crimes than 10 years ago, even with the budget twice as big, because it doesn't really work. I'm not suggesting that we should privatize the police, because that is maybe one of the things that you can't privatize, but you should really
Yeah.
be managing that sector better and focus on that, and not on, I mean, in Sweden we have privately run hospitals, and they work really well. Now we
Yeah.
see that, especially from the left side in politics, they try to socialize healthcare, schooling. That we have free schools in Sweden that are run by private companies, and they work really well. But now
Yeah.
they're trying take back control and socialize it.
So I wanted to ask you about some of those elements of Swedish economy and the way that Sweden's organized in a moment. But just to stay on the 1990s point for a bit, I really like your way of seeing it, which is you don't even need to necessarily cut spending. If you can just freeze it and hold it down and then do positive things on deregulation, on improving the tax system, you can actually improve the overall fiscal situation in the long term. And there's a great example of this here. So during the summer, we had a massive debate about welfare, and the government put forward a bill that would have meant that the welfare spending on working age people would have only increased from 70 billion to 95 billion instead of 70 billion to 100 billion. So we're still talking about a very, very significant increase. It would have just slightly slowed the increase. And yet we couldn't even get that through, which was extraordinary. Is there any lessons from the political situation in the 1990s? You mentioned it was the Social Democratic Party, the more left-leaning party that did this in the 1990s. How difficult was that politically for them? Did it mean they lost elections? Has it been seen in that party as, one of the great humiliations, or is it something which they actually look back on and think, we were grown up about that, we recognized that we had to take difficult decisions and we made them? How is that sort of viewed in the Swedish political landscape?
I think it's a bit of both, actually, to the more left side of the party, because this is a party that, there are people there who are really left-leaning, and there are some people in the Social Democratic Party that is, economically quite liberal. Mm-hmm. So, I think they take pride in what they did in the 90s, but there are voices within the movement that are really skeptical about this, and they think still that they should have just risen the taxes, and that would have solved the problem.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of both, but for most parts, they're proud of it because they really want to be perceived as a party that is responsible and a party for grown-ups. But in good times, and their goal is always to have a big public sector with a lot of political control. So that is always their goal. They have been experimenting they didn't oppose to free schools for quite many years, but now they see this as a way of, getting more votes, I think.
Yeah.
If you see a problem in any sector, we had a huge migration in Sweden. We're 10 million inhabitants, and during the last 20 years, we took in 10% are now from abroad, and especially Asia and Africa. And that creates huge problem, especially with unemployment, I would say. Mm. So we have huge problems, and the problem, and of course, people that don't speak the language will not perform well in schools. And their solution to these problems is taking back control and pouring more money on it. So of course we have that debate, but I think we should look. We did that when I had my political awakening in the late 80s. We looked a lot at Great Britain and Margaret Thatcher and what she did. And I think that home ownership is something that is really important. And I think that in Sweden, we have a system since the 90s where a part of your pension is placed on the stock market, which you control yourself. It's not a huge bit, but that means that people are more self-reliant. If you own your own home, and if you have, money that is not handed out by politicians, but is your own when you retire, you are more likely to take responsible for your own actions, and you're not as likely to vote for politicians that are left-leaning or saying that they will solve your problems. So that's a friend of mine, a professor in economics, Daniel Waldenström, wrote a book. It was actually published in English first. It's called, Richer and More Equal. It was released, I think, this spring. And he describes how Sweden was a poor country and where there was huge gaps between the rich and poor, and that is not the case anymore because a lot of people own their own homes. They have money placed in stocks, and that makes them more rich and more equal. So I think that is a way of letting people take care of their own house and their own money and save their own money for their pension. That is a way to push to not let the government be so involved in your life.
Yeah.
So these structural things makes people more right-leaning, but also, richer.
So to ask you a little bit about Sweden at present, it seems like Sweden has a little bit of something for everyone in the political spectrum, because the left talk about Sweden a lot as a model of social democracy. The left like to say public spending is a lot higher in Sweden. They like to say that taxation is a lot higher in Sweden than it is here. I think that gap is starting to close between our two countries, but it still exists. And they say that Sweden is a model that actually the way to successfully run a country is higher spending, higher taxes. But the right also like to point out on the other side that, well, yes, Sweden spends a lot more money than the UK government does. Again, as I said, that's closing, but it still exists. Sweden makes far greater use of free market and private sector in the way that particularly you run services. So you mentioned the extent to which the private sector is involved in your education system, but also your health system. And I wanted to ask you, from a free market perspective, to a free market person in England, should they be looking at Sweden as a success story or not a success story, or somewhere in the middle? How do you see that? How do you see Sweden from a sort of free market perspective?
From a free market perspective, I think we are very successful. I mean, that is one good thing with the Swedish Social Democrats and the trade unions in Sweden. They have never opposed free trade. They have been, very reliable in free trade issues. So that has been very, very good for Sweden. And for some parts, we're a socialist success or a discouraging example. But for many reasons, we are not. And I would say that in the early 1980s, Sweden was heading towards becoming like a part of the Soviet Empire, or actually something like Yugoslavia was back then.
Yeah.
Or Albania. A socialist country not associated with the Soviet Union, but still a socialistic country. But even large groups within the Social Democratic Party saw that this couldn't last. This doesn't really work. And a lot of the reforms that I mentioned was actually designed by the Social Democrats to open up the currency market, to lower the extremely high marginal taxes. It was all by the hand of the Social Democrats because they understood that this system doesn't work. So we have, I would say, we have too high taxes, and we have some other issues, but I would say taxes are one of our biggest problems. But regarding the free market, we work quite well, even compared to Great Britain or the US, I would say.
Yeah. And just before you go, I know that the Swedish Taxpayers Association was founded, I think it was in 1921, which must make you one of the oldest of our types of group in the world. Just tell me a little bit about that, how you were founded, why it was so many decades ago.
Yeah, I like to point out that we are one of the least successful organizations in Sweden, because when we were founded, the taxes were around 10%. So I don't know if we've done a good job. Oh, well, we have a lot of reforms behind us. I think we're the second oldest. I think the the Australian organization was founded in 1919, I think. But we're the second
close.
oldest. but so we're a member-funded organization, and this day we have 30,000 members that pay my salary and my colleagues' salaries, and we have been working with the same three issues since the beginning. I mean, lower taxes and fair taxes, less waste with government money, and a due judicial process in tax regarded issues. So we've been working with that, and we have our own paper. And I mean, we were born from Swedish industrialists saying that now that the government is growing, we have to take care so it doesn't grow too fast or too much, or take over everything, and so that we, I mean, might become a socialist country. So that was the big scare from industrialists back then, and we've continued ever since working in that direction. So, and I mean, the reform where the marginal taxes were cut from 80 to 50%, I mean, still high, in the early 90s, that was actually our design. In Sweden, we don't have any property tax for private citizens, and that is also a campaign that we had 20 years ago that then became law. So we don't have any, I mean, we have a small municipal property tax, but it's really small, and that is really great because people are not taxed from their homes anymore, which was the case before. So we've won a couple of big fights, and during the last couple of years, we stopped an exit tax, which they later on introduced in Norway. And in Norway, people with money or companies move from Norway. I mean, you have the same problem in Great Britain. People are moving from London to Italy and Switzerland.
Yeah, well, on that note, I'm afraid to say I think we've got property taxes coming, significant property taxes coming to the UK at the budget later this year. But on that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Christian. Hopefully, in 104 years' time, our successors will do a similar call to celebrate your 200th anniversary or whatever it will be. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.